without further ado, Serena.
All right, hi everyone. Hi students. Okay, I have a couple of slides. Let me share them and be as quick as I can. Okay, I'm going to talk about my research that was just published in my book called No Refuge. Before I do that, I want to just give a quick shout out to the Minorities in Philosophy student group, which is just launching right now. And it will sort of be in force in the spring. So faculty members, if you could spread the word, encourage students to look this up. Katie just sent this out this morning. Students, if you're interested, this is a club for everybody, minority or not, and minority understood in the broadest sense of race, ethnicity, disability, sexuality, national heritage. It's a community building group, and it's meant to just allow students an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit and read topics, read philosophy by and about people from marginalized groups. So Professor Strump and I are the faculty liaisons for it. It looks like it's going to be a great group. So I really, really encourage everyone to check it out and spread the word for its spring launch. Okay, so my work is on the global refugee crisis, as some of you may know. And my take is the following. Basically, I argue that there is not one global refugee crisis, but there are two refugee crises. The first refugee crisis is the one that is most familiar to all of us, or to many of us at least, and it's the crisis of people coming into our countries or asking to come into our countries to seek asylum. In the US context particularly, it's Central Americans arriving at the southern border. In the European context, it's people arriving in Italy and Greece, largely from Syria and Africa. And from different places around the world. So we experience this as a crisis of identity, a crisis of immigration, a crisis of border security. But the flip side of this is what I call the problem we have created. And the problem is that if you are a refugee in the 21st century, you don't have access to refuge. So the international community gives you three options. One is refugee camps. The other is informal urban settlements, but without virtually any international aid or help. And the third is you need to pay smugglers to take very, very dangerous journeys in order to arrive in the country you want to give you refugee status, and that's called seeking asylum. And the problem is that each of these options fail to provide the minimum conditions of human dignity. So in my book, I go through all of these three options, how they arise, and why they are ultimately all failures. So I hope then that people come to understand the global refugee crisis in the following way. The vast majority of refugees, well over 90%, stay in the global south, in either underfunded insecure camps or in urban squalor for an average of 17 years, with less than a 1% chance of being resettled in a country like the United States or Italy or France or the UK. About 10% take their chances and being smuggled to seek asylum, risking torture, sexual assault, and death. And I argue that this is an injustice we, namely citizens of Western democratic countries, have largely created via our policies around not only refugees and asylum seekers, but around security and development. So in the second part of the book, I give a framing for how we should understand this injustice. And I suggest that we should understand it as a structural injustice. So this term comes from the philosopher Iris Marion Young. And she argues that there are many injustices, both domestic and international, that are wrong, that are moral wrong. Say sweatshops is one example that she talks about. Gentrification that leads to homelessness in the US is another example she talks about. So these are wrong, these are moral harms, but they're not intentional. They result from everyone acting according to their own interests and largely according to accepted norms and rules. Now, I think this analysis can be applied to the current global refugee crisis that I just described to you. I think the outcome by almost any standard is unjust, right? It's unjust that fewer than 2% of refugees have access to any of the solutions that the international community claims they should have access to, and the rest are in really dire conditions. Now, I think that most often we can understand this result not as the malicious intention of states. certainly not due to the bad decisions by refugees, but it is due to each state acting according to what they think of as their own interest and according to widely accepted practices around immigration, around border security, etc. My goal in presenting it like this is to allow us to shift our thinking on responsibility to refugees, as well as how we think of our positive and negative duties towards refugees. Just really briefly, we usually think that our strongest obligation to refugees is to allow them to resettle or allow them to enter via asylum. I think we need to sort of reframe that and think really hard about our negative duties not to harm refugees via our asylum and immigration and border security policies, the separation of children at the border and the missing parents of over 500 children being perhaps the most immediately noteworthy and widely talked about example of this. And then as well, I think once we frame it like this, it gives rise to a whole host of other positive duties and different ways that we can engage with helping refugees. All right, that's it, Don. I took my time limit seriously.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you used all 5 minutes, because it took me that long to reboot my computer and get away from whatever Zoom did to me, crashing in the middle of everybody joining the meeting. But I'm back. Okay, so I'm next on the schedule, so I will try and be quick. Let's see. Okay. Oh man, I am not having any luck today. Okay, so I'm going to do mine without slides because I can't share. So my research is in the area of epistemology. So I study how people acquire knowledge. And if you're interested in the ways in which people can acquire knowledge, um, you have to be concerned with possible threats to that knowledge. So there's things like optical illusions or other sorts of perceptual illusions could cause us to have false beliefs. Cognitive errors of the kind that Kahneman and Tversky talk about could cause us to have false beliefs. But we can also end up with false beliefs or be prevented from acquiring knowledge because there's somebody out there who's actively trying to mess with our ability to acquire knowledge, somebody who's actively trying to deceive us. And so in order to address this sort of threat, I'm trying to sort of better understand what deception is and what are the different ways in which deception occurs. And so over the past few years, I've been dealing with questions of what exactly counts as deception. So for example, is it deception if you operate on somebody's brain and implant a false belief using some mechanism out of, say, a Star Trek episode? Is it deception if a pharmaceutical company colors their pills blue with knowing that people will think that this makes it more likely that their tranquilizers are effective? But of course, it's not clear that how this could be deception, because the pills had to be some color. So why is blue deceptive? Another question is it deception? Is it only deception when you cause somebody to have a false belief, or does merely preventing somebody from acquiring true beliefs count as deception? And finally, I'm interested in whether animal mimicry counts as deception. So animals have often evolved to mimic other animals, so it's not intentional deception on their part. And in addition, it's not even clear that what is caused by animal mimicry makes us epistemically worse off, because after all, if we see a snake that mimics the appearance of another snake, now at least we know that we're dealing with the real thing or with a mimic. And so these are sort of active debates in the philosophy of deception, but I've sort of decided that figuring out exactly how to draw the line between deception and non-deception is not exactly the most useful thing for epistemological purposes. If we want to avoid being misled, it's better to understand the various ways in which we can be deceived. So what I'm currently working on is trying to develop a taxonomy of deception, or as a way of avoiding all these debates about what counts as deception, I'm sort of coining the term epistemic interference. So you're epistemically interfered with whenever somebody causes a false belief, whether or not that counts as deception, say, for example, if you're operating on somebody's brain. And so I'm trying to figure out the various ways in which epistemic interference can occur. Often it's perceptual, but sometimes, as with the case of the operating of the brain, it happens in other ways. Often it involves changing the amount of information that somebody gets about the world, but merely coloring a pill is an example of something that doesn't deceive by altering the amount of information. And then within this category of epistemic interference that involves altering the amount of information in the world, there's a whole host of different sort of techniques that counterintelligence analysts have described, like dazzling, mimicking, and masking. And I'm trying to understand how all these different techniques work, in particular, how they work epistemically, how they affect our ability to acquire knowledge in the world. Okay, that's it for me. Okay, so next is Candice.
Thanks, Don. So I'm gonna share. I can't share full screen for some reason. It just makes my computer go black. So hi, I'm Candice Delmas. I'm in philosophy and political science. I'm first going to tell you a little bit about the course. I guess I got the different memo. I thought we were also supposed to present spring teaching. So very briefly, I teach social and political philosophy for philosophy and contemporary political thought for political science. The overall goal in both classes is to equip students with the tools to understand today's pressing political issues. So I have changed the syllabi quite greatly to include a lot on racial justice and social movements to understand what's been happening with Black Lives Matter protests, especially this summer. Both classes go from political authority to economic and social justice and freedom and oppression, but there are different emphases in each class. With some classical anti-colonial, anti-racist feminist thinkers in one, and an emphasis on social justice, and in the other, a unit on truth and politics, and a big unit on political praxis. There are in-class debates, there's a lot of discussion and group projects, presentations at every class, an editorial, and fun guest speakers. Okay, hope to see some of you in my classes. I have just begun a new project on hunger strikes that's tentatively titled The Only Weapon Left. I'm interested in the nature and ethics of hunger strikes, so I wrote my first book on civil and uncivil disobedience, and I thought that all the philosophers who think that hunger strike is a tactic of civil disobedience are wrong. They're wrong because it is profoundly illiberal, it is violent, and involves self-destructive resistance, and it is very coercive. And in some cases, authorities deem it a kind of blackmail. I am particularly interested in the value and the effects of suffering in hunger strike, which brings me in part to look at the power of unearned suffering from theorizers like thinkers, practitioners like Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. Also some theologic and religious text on asceticism and mysticism to understand the self-discipline and the powers of spectacular displays of suffering. I'm interested in how to think about coercive interference with hunger strikes by prison authorities and governments, what kind of rationales they put forth. So Israel says it's asymmetrical warfare. The medical ethics, the medical profession as a whole says any interference is wrong. We need to help manage and supervise hunger strike. The first part of my project is a paper on the right to hunger strike that I ground on a right to resist oppression. And I want to tell you a little bit about the possible research assistants. I have one right now who's been working with me for almost a year. She helped me a great deal with the research on asceticism, mysticism, on Massachusetts prison legal advocacy work. And she helps me with the bibliography and formatting. She's also looking at text in aesthetics and performance studies to understand the corporeality of hunger strike. She is conducting her own research on Palestinian hunger strike. I still need to complete the picture on how different countries, prison systems, and refugee camps deal with hunger strikes and other protests. I need to undertake some FOIA requests in prison to see how particular prisons deal with hunger strikes. And I am delving into domination and resistance in psychiatric settings because of the pathologization of hunger strikes in various contexts. And again, the aesthetic aspect of it to understand better why witnessing suffering moves us in the way it can do. Thank you.
Okay, Jacob.
Hey, Son. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob Stump. I teach philosophy here. Here's a question. What is love? So we talk about love in lots of different ways. On the one hand, we talk about love as a sort of emotion. It's something that happens to us. It's something we're passive before. It's something outside of our control. We talk about falling in love. We talk about falling out of love. On the other hand, though, we don't talk about love so much as an emotion as a commitment. It's like something we actively participate in, something we actively do. We talk about choosing to love. Okay, so what's going on here? Are there two different kinds of love? If so, in virtue of what are they both kinds of love instead of two totally different mental attitudes? If they are both kinds of love, what distinguishes them? I think these are exciting questions. I think there's a reason people are like often very interested in these questions. I also think there are no good answers to these questions in contemporary philosophy. And I think the best answers we've ever got to them in the history of philosophy are in Plato. So the current paper I'm writing is on this question, what is love for Plato? Sorry, it's not like what is love, sorry, it's like what is love for Plato, like what is Plato's conception of love? But more specifically, it's like what is Plato's conception of eros, E-R-O-S, erotic desire or erotic love? You might not be surprised to learn there's been like tons written on this. I think it's all quite bad. So the paper is really doing this kind of fundamental work of getting clear on this fundamental mental component, one that I think is actually way more important for Plato's moral psychology than people think. All right, so the view has lots of parts. Here's basically what I'm arguing for. All and only instances of love, eros, are in response to what a person perceives to be beautiful. The one sort, though, is for what a person perceives to be beautiful in virtue of its pleasure. The other sort, in virtue of its being good, or more specifically, most central to happiness. Okay, and the upshot of the paper is like, think of like an archaeologist, like rummages around in like dirt and stone, and like finds some jug and puts it on display so we can see exactly what it is. That's how I'm thinking of this paper. I'm not like rummaging around in dirt and stone. Like, unfortunately, that'd be so fun. I wish that's what I was doing. I'm rummaging around in like Plato's text to try to unearth this notion so we can see that mental component clearly. I also think that like with lots of things, better understanding this historical notion of eros can help us better understand our experiences of love today. Okay, that's the current paper I'm writing. I'll mention briefly two last things. One thing is this paper is part of a larger book project on conversion or value transformation in Plato. So the big question I'm asking is like, how does Plato think we can change what people value the most? Where this paper fits in is I think if we understand Plato's moral psychology rightly, that's just a question of how we can change what people love. In particular, the object of their eros, what they desire qua central to happiness. Last thing I'll mention, this is a bit of a plug. I'm teaching the philosophy of emotions here next semester. It's a brand new course. If you find these questions interesting, you should consider enrolling in it. Our primary focus is on contemporary philosophy, not the history of philosophy, but we will be spending the last third of the semester on love, and we'll be reading a bit of Plato in that. All right, that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Sheila.
Okay, I'm trying to share a slide. All right. So I'm Sheila Winborn, and I teach interdisciplinary courses in religious studies, philosophy, and film. And I'm on the religious studies side of the department. And I also have some background in philosophy. And I have extensive experiences in analysis of visual culture, as well as practical experiences creating in each of the media about which I teach and do research. In my courses, I consider the relationship between historical and contemporary approaches to film representations, including how some historical films communicate prophetic predictions about how we currently live. In the spring, I'll be teaching 2 sections of apocalypticism in film and 1 section of the problem of evil in film. And as I usually do each fall, I'm currently teaching a course entitled Science Fiction in Film, subtitled Moral Dilemmas and Ethical Analysis. Also, I'm finalizing a proposal to possibly teach at some point next year a course on race in film. So, my current main research projects each are books that focus on the concept of apocalypticism to varying extents. My research in general deals with interdisciplinary research methods to analysis on visual culture of the 19th, 20th, or 21st century. The first book is tentatively titled Behold It Is I, subtitled A Theological Interpretation of F. Holland Day's photographic representations of persons of African descent, and is mostly complete except for the final sign off from our readers and the forward writer. And at the turn of the 20th century, the European American F. Holland Day represented persons of the African diaspora, for example, in this top image here on this slide. And the image is titled Apocalyptic, the image is an apocalyptic image titled Armageddon. In the centerpiece of this work of art, I further uncover how Day predicts that when Jesus Christ returns to earth to judge all of humanity, as described in the Christian New Testament book of Revelation, that he will return in the image of an Ethiopian monarch. And I compared Day's idealized representations of persons of the African diaspora to the more pragmatic approaches of African-American photographers of the same period, such as James Van Der Zee and the photographers whose works were included in the 1900 Paris exhibition that was compiled by W.E.B. Du Bois. The second project I'm working on is a book that the current working title is The Problem of Slavery in Apocalyptic Films. And if I were to give this manuscript a subtitle, it would be Cautionary Tales about What It Means to Be Human. I consider the variety of ways slavery is represented in apocalyptic themed films, with slavery being one of the most reoccurring themes within apocalyptic as well as science fiction films. I explore how films influence and reflect the ways humans define and represent persons as the other. Also, I explore questions such as, is slavery less of a moral concern when the slaves are represented as machines, animals such as apes, extraterrestrial aliens, or even Walking Dead zombies? And how do the variety of ways that slavery is represented in apocalyptic films relate to the contemporary fact that currently over 40 million documented humans live in various forms of slavery in almost every part of our world, including some of them bought and sold for economic gains and living partly in plain sight in the US in states such as Georgia and Massachusetts. This is the case although the United Nations has declared slavery illegal in our contemporary world. I also consider how the writer Oscar Wilde once stated that although slavery is wrong, insecure, and demoralizing, that civilizations require the free work of slaves for economic gains, and therein to do the ugly, horrible, uninteresting work. And he predicted that on mechanical slavery, the future of the world depends. If we are to accept that Wilde is correct, what morally does this say about what it means to be human? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brandon.
Thanks a lot. I just want to start by thanking Don and Katie for organizing this, and say how just wonderful it is to see such a wide variety of interesting ideas and projects, and it's just a testament to how great this department is. Today, I want to talk to you about a project that's been many years in the making, 3 or 4 years, and the paper's finally done. So I think this should be working. So this project is called 4 Approaches to Supposition, and I had the pleasure of working on this for the last few years with 2 really excellent junior scholars, Ben Eva, who just started a job at Duke University, and Ted Shearer, who just started teaching at the University of Colorado at Boulder. So the easiest way to get into this project is to consider 2 examples. So I have sentences 1 and 2 on this slide here. Sentence 1 says, if Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, then someone else did. So that's a P arrow cue. And 2 is, if Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, then someone else would have. That's the box arrow. So the first one is called an indicative conditional, and the second one's called a subjunctive, because those are the moods that they're in. Sometimes the second one's called a counterfactual or contrary to fact conditional. Intuitively, claim 1 seems likely. It seems likely that if Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, then someone did, because, you know, he was shot. On the other hand, claim 2 is not likely. If Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, I wouldn't say that it's likely that someone else would have. We could debate about that, but at least it's less likely than 1. Another way to put this is, if we suppose the antecedent of 1, then we're inclined to see its consequent as likely, but not so for 2. Similarly, if we suppose 1's antecedent, we're inclined to infer its consequent, but we're not inclined to make such an inference in case 2. So this project is looking at both indicative and subjunctive suppositions, the sorts that are exhibited in 1 and 2, and in both qualitative and quantitative terms. So here's a simple table to sort of summarize what this paper does. It's a pretty exhaustive paper. So you've got a 2x2 table here, as everyone knows. I was a student of Elliott Sober, so you were likely to see a 2x2 table here somewhere. Here it is. So you've got the columns are quantitative, so those are questions of likelihood or probability. And on the right, you've got questions about inference. Those are qualitative things, more think logic, okay, or something like that. And then the rows are indicative versus subjunctive or counterfactual. And so that gives you 4 things to think about here. And in the existing literature, there's already theories of all 4 of these things. In the upper left quadrant, there's what's called Bayesian conditionalization. In the lower left, there's what's called Bayesian imaging. Upper right, there's a system that computer scientists and logicians call AGM. And in the lower right, there's a system similarly that computer scientists and logicians call KM. Our paper provides a complete characterization of the relations between all these different theories. It's the first time that's ever been done as well. And I will paste a link to the manuscript if anyone's interested in the chat. That's it for me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Chad.
Let me just see if I can get the screen shared here. Whiteboard, where's whiteboard? No. Okay. Just a moment. Oh boy. Okay. I, like Don, may have troubles with this. Let me just see one more chance to do this. My goodness. Sorry about this, everybody. I'll just press on ahead without, and hopefully you'll get a good picture of what I'm after when what I'm about when I'm researching, when I'm teaching. So my research at a broad level is about how information or lack thereof can, lacking information can affect our ethical obligations. And a lot of my research kind of filters down into the everyday in many different ways that I think we experience, such as when you're on Facebook and you see a friend post misinformation, what do? Do you challenge it? Do you share it? Do you ignore it? The effects of misinformation spreading on social networks is something that has become the responsibility, it seems, of individuals to deal with, although these companies are doing more and more, I guess, to prevent it. There's a challenge for individuals who are using technology to try to assess the risks of their actions in ways that very hard to get at when you're just trying to click through and you're not sure whether to share some particular piece of information. So part of one of the dimensions of my work is about the risks of sharing information, when you should get more information, and what ought you to do in a kind of democratic system when you are facing conflicting or disinformation or deception, as related to Don's work. Zooming out a little bit, you may ask, what are the responsibilities of the platforms and the information technology systems that we're a part of to mitigate risk? So consider a case where you're using Google Maps and it tells you to get off the highway and travel down this residential area. You can see children playing. You can see that it's really not the kind of place where lots of traffic should be diverted. Yet it's supposed to save you a couple of minutes. In this case, you might ask, should I do it? But then there's a further question, which is about the structure of the situation, which is what perhaps it could be put as, what kind of right does a company have to increase the risk that particular residents of a neighborhood face that's kind of subverting the existing infrastructure of the roads to try to ensure that its customers have a slightly better driving experience? A third kind of question about the structures of these information technologies is how they make decisions and how scrutable they are to us. Consider an example where you're going to be applying for co-op and you submit your resume and it goes off, but it's not read by a human. It, perhaps in this case, it's read by a computer. An algorithm goes through and picks out keywords and tries to assess how viable you are as a candidate for their program. And perhaps it rejects you. You might want to know why. Why did it do so? And on what grounds? And do I have any recourse to this? After all, there's now extensive evidence that certain keywords in everyday in these applications can lead to systematic disadvantages for particular kinds of people, particularly women and people of color. So there are questions about the opacity of these systems that we're being kind of subjected to, that we're participating in, and whether there are ethical concerns about whether they should be how they are designed and who they are imposed upon. And finally, as another quick example of the kind of everyday interface of technology, information, in our everyday lives, consider a case where you pick up your phone intending to check the weather, and before you know it, you've spent the last 20 minutes scrolling on social media in a kind of fugue state. What happened? It's a it's a regular enough occurrence, and it's happening to all of us, but it's by design a lot of the time. And there's a question about the moral responsibilities of these companies that are, say, providing social media to not subvert our agency, our ability to make decisions, to be our own authors of our lives, to kind of hijack through very sophisticated designs and systems the way we make decisions. So within this sort of realm of individual cases, there are more general principles that we might want to ask from an ethical point of view about the proper role of technology in a kind of well-functioning democratic society in which there are free and equal individuals. A lot of my research at the moment is about authority. It's about risk and cases where you're not certain whether the authority is a legitimate authority, and you nevertheless have to gamble about whether to follow it. Other examples include in interface with philosophy of biology, the idea of agency, and whether these artificially intelligent systems can have a low level of agency that can be somewhere in between group agents and individual agents. I see Don has popped up, so I may have overrun my time. And feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'll be teaching ethics and technology, ethics and human values, technology and human values next semester. And I'm sure I'll have my slides working by then. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Pat.
Hi, I'm not even going to try to do slides. I'm Patricia Williams, and in my research, I have a book forthcoming in March from HarperCollins entitled Race and Romance, Why Gone with the Wind Keeps Blowing Back. And I have a piece forthcoming from the philosophy journal Theory and Event entitled The Metaphoricity of Skittles, which is a reference to Trayvon Martin, and looking at how hunting metaphors are used in a series of criminal law cases, and how images, metaphors, and what some have called matterphors weave images of the animal and the human together in our discourse of patrolling social boundaries. So, as you can tell, I do jurisprudence and cultural theory. I'm trained as a lawyer with a half-time appointment within the law school, and like most lawyers at this moment in time, my current work is a study of loneliness. First, let me say that one of the resources I use in my classes is a wonderful book by philosopher Jill Stauffer entitled Ethical Loneliness, on the Injustice of Not Being Heard. And her book refers to the experience of being abandoned by humanity, of being invisible. That study is specifically about human rights and the study of refugees, migrants, and those marked as beyond the pale, raced, gendered, or otherwise institutionally disabled, designated civiliter mortuus, or civilly dead. So if Stauffer's work is specifically about not being heard, as in not having the ability to testify in courts, to make legal claim, to be recognized in law, my work is more about the injustice of not being seen. I am writing about the concept of loneliness as a technological trace, a machine-altered state of reality manifested variously as certain brands of algorithmic isolation, ultra-libertarianism, obsessive forms of control, and narcissism as an expressive limitation. I'm concerned about how, on the one hand, we have whole worlds of information at our fingertips, as served up by efficient new technologies that promised, and to great extent delivered, global connectivity, yet that information has not been given context or settled into easy cultures of coexistence. Rather, we are more dangerously siloed than ever, isolated as individuals, or locked into echo chambers of groupthink, our curiosity detoured by algorithmically structured roadblocks of fear, merchandise, narrow-mindedness, and the seductions of fictionalized reality. And reality always exists eternally, in quotes, in scare quotes at that. And so these kinds of algorithmic assortments on social media work their magic to modify community space into a patchwork of individualistic principalities, each its own tense little war zone, its own guarded turf, subject to eruption without warning. And these projections of freedom as ultimate control are accompanied by a form of subjectivity fantasized as immune, sovereignly immune to consequence, because it is built into the machine or defined inherently as ungovernable. And this extreme form of libertarianism or narcissism rationalizes itself, the one and only self, as resolutely singular, even when staring down webs of life. At this moment, not just viral life as a metaphor, but coronavirally, resolutely singular, in which we are all invisibly and nevertheless irretrievably enmeshed, both institutionally and biologically. And so this exercise of ungoverned self-declared sovereignty undermines anything like democracy or representative government or federalism or unity of states. And power from the top is almost gaseous, suggested but not coordinated, envisioned but not visible, insinuated but rarely stated. As a result, no single person or institution can easily be brought to account. Some have written about the degree to which we increasingly exist in a closed circuit of perfect synchronization. We are all everywhere in the world simultaneously, and that kind of perfect synchrony is the same thing as immobility. And this I find conceptually tantalizing, a global segmentation within a comprehensive unity. It perhaps leads to what Michel Foucault wrote of times like this, a claustrophobic panic that leads to an entire culture of panic. Paul Virilio has spoken of what Durkheim called the suicidal state, the anguish of permanent stress, which makes the acceptance of death feasible and even more desirable than living that life. And I think of that when I hear commentators like Glenn Beck say, even if we all get sick, I would rather die than kill the country. We seem to be living in a moment which is not we the people as much as kamikaze self-sacrifice for a figuration that has a vitality greater than we ourselves, which we call the economy or something. But I was recently reading an essay by Sabrina Ora-Mark in the Paris Review entitled, "I'm So Tired." And she writes about her family's anxiety about her sister, who is quite ill, and her very sad mother says, "I need someplace to go." And Marx writes, "What I don't tell my mother is that we have already gone somewhere. We are already in this place where the world we once knew is rushing out of us." And these words have stayed with me. If there is any consistency to what perhaps we are all feeling, it is captured by that paragraph. There's such affecting particularity in that vision of the external world, not just changing around us, but of interior worlds rushing out. And so I am particularly interested in that dimension of effective, technologically inflected identity politics, the loneliness of the ungovernable, isolated, solo sovereign. So this effective dimension of ungoverned loneliness will be explored in the course I'm teaching in the spring, entitled Justice and Aesthetics, and we'll study how justice appears or disappears, who is deemed authoritative, what is seen as legitimate. We'll look at the interplay of subjective and collective perception, the memorialized and the swiftly, ungrievably forgotten, the documentary, the archived, the constitutive yearning we construct in what we call constitution, particularly constitutional law, as one world-building response to ethical loneliness.
Thank you. I guess Rory is next up.
Hey everyone, I'm Rory. I do the mathy, sciencey kind of philosophy. This spring I'm teaching a course in philosophy of economics. Today I'll give you guys a little snippet into one of my projects that I've been working on recently. And let's hope the screen sharing works. It looks like it might be. Huzzah. Okay. So I'm going to combine two things that have been hot topics in 2020, spite and contagion. Although in 2020, those are usually in different areas. I'm going to put them in the same area. So this is a project that I've been working on with the guys in network science, as well as one of my collaborators at Tufts. we've been thinking about how spiteful behavior might spread through populations of more sophisticated individuals. I normally think about animals, like that yellow-rumped cacique there, but we're thinking about humans now. We're thinking about how spite might spread through human cultural populations. So first, a quick little overview on what spite is. Spite, we're going to think of very minimally. Of course, in humans, spite has a very rich intellectual and cognitive and emotional component. But in these simple models we look at, we think about it as bare bones as possible. Spite is just something that is costly to you and harmful to others, or costly to the actor and harmful to others. So in the simplest way to represent this, there's some benefit that people get from normal, non-spiteful interactions. And then there's some opportunity to spite where you can remove that benefit and pay a cost. So we think about spiteful behavior as paying a cost to inflict a harm / remove a benefit. It's all the same in these models. And social behavior is not being spiteful, sort of minimal type of social behavior. It's well known in the literature and the classic understandings on the theory behind why spite emerges and why it gets maintained, that anytime you have sufficient anti-correlation or negative assortment in the population, you can get spite. What does that mean? It means that when spite is directed disproportionately at non-spiteful individuals, it can start sort of spreading through the population. If spite gets reflected back on spiteful individuals, then it tends to undermine itself. So whenever you get circumstances where spite is directed away from spiteful individuals, that's when it tends to take over. But a lot of the literature has been silent about how that sort of comes about. How does this anti-correlation and this negative assortment happen? And we went ahead and explicitly modeled this using some techniques in dynamic networks. So we build a little model where agents are interacting. So in this little picture here, we've got 5 agents interacting. Every day, they're assigned to either be a spiteful type or a social type. They just do their thing when they interact. And every day they choose one individual to interact with. They go meet that individual. Each of the 2 individuals have an opportunity to spite one another or not spite one another. And then after they interact, they update their connections. Did that interaction go well for me? If so, I'm going to go back and do that some more. Did it go poorly for me? If not, I'm going to go visit somebody else in the future. So this is individuals updating who they're trying to interact with over time. And then every once in a while, this is part 3 here, every once in a while, the individuals look around and they see who they're interacting with and what those individuals are doing. And if those individuals are doing better than them, they'll adopt whatever behavior those other individuals are doing, the ones that are doing better than them, sort of simple imitation behavior. We use simple reinforcement learning to model who people are interacting with, and simple imitation learning to decide what social behaviors are going on. So there's 2 components: who you interact with and what you do. You decide who you interact with based on the payoffs you've received, and you decide what to do based on what other individuals are doing and how well they're doing. When we turn these sort of agents loose in these computer simulations, what happens is we start with this random mixture. Some agents are spiteful, some agents are social, and they're not really visiting anyone with any significant patterns. But then eventually patterns start to emerge, and social agents start attracting more and more visitors, because no one wants to interact with spiteful agents. You want to interact with social agents. So people start interacting with social agents. And the spiteful agents get sort of ostracized. So far, this looks like good news for social non-spiteful behavior, except if we let this keep running, the spiteful behavior gets more and more ostracized to the outside of the social networks. And then it sort of rapidly takes over eventually. And what happens here, what's going on, is that if we look at, let me annotate here quick. If we look at this interaction here between that social agent and that spiteful agent, this spiteful agent tends to not get very many interactions. The only interaction they really have is when they go visit this social agent. This social agent gets visited by a few others, but mainly gets visited by this other spiteful agent. So this social agent has a lot of his interactions being taken up by spiteful interactions with other agents, even though they themselves are not spiteful. When that social agent looks around to imitate others, they notice that on average, that guy's doing better than he is. Why? Because this guy doesn't interact with as many spiteful agents as that guy does. So the social agents become a target of spite. And then once they become a target of spite, the social agents think, hey, those spiteful agents are actually doing better on average than I am. So I'm going to become a spiteful agent too. They get ostracized and the process continues until everybody is spiteful. So what we see is this sort of contagious spread of spite via relative advantages that are gained. Now, these are all costly things for the spiteful individuals. It's just relative advantages that are driving this. One interesting little note that we get out of all this, this is a sort of graph of the average results. Normally you see spite decrease a little bit before it invades and takes over the whole population. The average amount of correlated interaction represented by that yellow line there is significantly above the classic theoretical thresholds for spite, which means you don't need significant negative assortment in the populations as has traditionally been thought to get the spread of spite. So in critters like humans, spite can be contagious as long as we're sensitive to relative differences in the payoffs. There we go.
All right. Thank you very much. Matt. Your mic is off.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Smith. I'm desperately trying to find my, there it is, and we will hit play. Hi, so my work is broadly in the philosophy of human agency and political theory. Right now, I'm going to talk to you about a little project, the sort of main thrust of the project I'm working on. It's not the only thing I'm doing. So we've got this great quote from Marshall McLuhan during the mechanical age. We've extended our bodies in space today after more than a century of electrical technology. We've extended our central nervous system itself in a global embrace, abolishing space and time. Now, it's not exactly, he wasn't really talking about human agency, but I like to take this as a kind of way to start off. This, it's 50 years ago that he was writing this. And actually, the central thesis that I work with is that human agency, our capacity to do things, to lead our lives, is actually realized in a distributed way, not just in our bodies, and that this has real significant upshots for understanding freedom, the political concept of freedom. So the central idea is that from turning on a light to walking together to painting a house, being able to act requires material in which the action can be realized. So, and I call this systems in which these material systems, broadly material systems, not always material, in which our agency is realized, I call them reliance systems because we rely on them in order to act. So the most basic reliance system is our body, right? In order to do things, we need bodies with which to do them, right? So for example, you might say that I'm able, say, to play the violin, but if I don't have limbs, typically you can't play the violin because you need arms or legs, presumably, typically, to play the violin. So you might say, he knows, maybe I knew how, I was trained to play the violin, but I lose my limbs, I can't play the violin anymore. So I no longer am able to, even if in some sense I know how to do it. Then I think but I think we can expand this out, because if I don't have a violin, I can't play the violin either. And a lot of what I do is try to break down this barrier between the body, our bodies, and the stuff that we use with our bodies in order to act. So that there's actually, I don't think there's really a meaningful barrier at all. In fact, our bodies, I think, are no different than the technologies that we use in order to do things. So our bodies are technologies is one of the theses that I have. So, the hammer that you use in order to hammer in a nail, that's no different than the hand that you're using. It's, we might call it an extension of the body, but I just want to treat all of it as a technology. The hand that I'm using to hammer is a technology, as is the hammer itself. What about things like, but this gets really interesting when we think about things like drinking water. So when you drink water, typically you turn on a tap, it pours water out. But actually there's these incredible systems that exist in order for that water to come out of that tap. And I actually don't think that there's a principal difference between the hand that you use to flip the tap to make the water run, the hand that you're using to hold the cup you're using for the water to go in, and the systems that are used to get that water to your, that tap water into your tap and into your sink. So we have to have we can have these entire systems, these reliance systems that are spread out and are collectively produced and reproduced, this is the stuff of our agency. These are the stuff that constitutes our capacities to act, and that's a lot of what I argue for. So you can have breaking systems like these pipes that are falling apart. So our agency become degraded as the systems around us become degraded. We have to constantly reproduce them. We have to manage them and support them. And so I think that that actually has very important political implications. What about walking? Something as simple as walking. Well, you know, if that bridge wasn't there, this fellow couldn't be walking across this little gorge here. And then traveling, you know, in order to get places, we have to travel. But if the traffic is so bad, you can't travel. You're not really going anywhere. I mean, are you able to drive from one place to another if traffic is standing still? No, you're not able. You're no more able to do that than if, for example, you were taped to your seat. And then we can have different modalities in which our cities are laid out so that there's different capacities that are realized in the same space. So I actually think that the reason why I put this slide in is that I wanted to contrast it with this slide. I wanted you all to look at this slide and think, well, gee, read this as a sign of the absence of freedom, right? This is actually freedom constrained. And here is freedom realized. And I think that there's no substantive difference between being taped to a seat, right, and locked to a seat and being able to do, not being able to do something, and then having, say, being untaped and being given a bicycle, and then, well, hey, look, given a bike path that's safe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden we have this image here of expanded freedom. And so that's one of the things that I'm arguing for. But look, I just took this picture today. Look, we're all having a conversation using Zoom. It's really quite remarkable, isn't it? I'll get this off because it's a little uncomfortable, I'm sure, for everyone to stare at it. But part of the point here is that this is a kind of prosthetic that expands our bodily capacity so that we can actually talk and meet. We can do things thanks to these kinds of these systems of information technology that expand our nervous systems in interesting ways, to call back to Marshall McLuhan. And so in some ways, I want to suggest that just as you might think of prosthetics as making up for lacks, so in this case, we have a prosthetic that makes up for the absence of an eye. This is from the post-World War I. These glasses, these spectacles help someone see. Here's another prosthetic from that era. We should also think of our prosthetics not as making up for lacks, but as actually extending our agency. So that there's prosthetics are more, they don't fill in blanks, they extend our capacities. And so here we have images like this, where you have a very, very simple prosthetic on the left going all the way to a prosthetic on the right, which for some people, actually, these can actually make people move faster if you have certain kinds of prosthetics on your legs. So all the way to very, very fancy forms of imagining our extended agency so that we actually have, you know, these robots that we are, as it were, minds are projected into. So this will come out, hopefully, I can actually write the book, a little bit hard under these conditions. Interesting to reflect on that. The book would be Material Freedom. And I'm working on that right now. It's an extension of a book that I actually, for some reason, I didn't have a slide of this book that just came out this year called The Spatial Contract, which I wrote with a political economist and an urban geographer, trying to explore kind of politics that is centered on this view of agency and freedom. And in particular, thinking about how we have to constantly produce and reproduce the systems of our that constitute our agency. That was from a more political economy point of view, and the book that I'm going to write here, Material Freedom, is more of a political theory book that'll be solely authored. And then I just wanted to throw in this fun thing that I have, this 3 Bodies Are Not a Problem essay that I've been kicking around that I'm hoping to finish. And that's the argument that, you know, philosophers get to be a little bit weird, but I'm actually totally serious about this, that we have 3 bodies is what I argue. The first body that we have is the anatomical body. It's, as it were, the body that, say, is infected by a virus or something like that. And it's the body that you might find in medical school, where there's these books that pick pictures of nervous systems and so on and so forth. You know, there's that as well. But then there's another body called the affective body. It's the body that we feel or experience with. It's sort of like the body of qualia, the body of perceptions, and so on and so forth. And then the third body is the agential body. And the agential body is the body that we do things with. And this body is collectively realized. There's no individualistic agential body in the contemporary world. all of our capacities are collectively realized. And so it's on this view, there's no such thing as it were, individual responsibility for action, because no action is individually undertaken. It's impossible, would be the upshot of this view. So it's a pretty radical view, and I'm hoping to work that out in the coming year. The classes I'll be teaching in the spring are economic justice and moral philosophy. I hope to see some of you in it, and thanks. How do I unshare?
Okay, Faticate. And your mic is off.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Faticate Castor, and I am a professor in the religion side of philosophy and religion. I'm also in Africana Studies. And let me do my share screen here. All right. So I research race, religion, and politics, specifically in the African diaspora, from the Caribbean to West Africa to the United States. And my research methods include ethnography, both in person and increasingly online, interviews, and media collection and analysis. So the creation of archives, to name a few. I teach classes on religion, popular culture, and social justice. Hold on, all right. So some of the critical research questions that I have is, how do people draw on African diasporic religion ways of knowing and spiritual technologies to work collectively to make change and build institutions, structures, communities directed at liberation, social justice, and freedom? And what does it mean to be a religion of resistance?
Is it just me, or have we lost Faticate?
I was about to ask that same question, so I've also lost it.
Okay, I guess maybe the time efficient thing to do would be to move on to John at this point, and then if Faticate comes back, we'll finish with her.
Sounds good. Everyone can hear me, I assume. I hope so. I'm not going to do screen share. Instead, if everyone, if you're inclined to see my slides, you can click the thing in the top corner that currently says speaker view, and that will switch it to just my face, and I'll just put my slides in where my face is, along with my face. If you don't want to see that, then you do you. Let's see, did that work? Yeah. Maybe this is even better. Yeah, cool. All right. So hi, I'm Professor Basil. I'm a professor in the philosophy department and also the undergraduate program director. Thanks for listening. So I'm gonna, instead of talking about a single research project to you, I'm gonna sort of give an overview, because I have my, what's the expression, my hands, irons and lots of fires, or something about pies, I don't know. I work mostly in the ethics of emerging technology. This includes things like artificial intelligence ethics, biotech and neuroengineering, and soon some projects in virtual and augmented reality and the ethics of those technologies. But I think it's most useful to think of my research as being along sort of two different tracks. Some of it is what I can call philosophically informed technology. That's where I try to bring to bear the insights of moral philosophy usually, but other parts of philosophy as well, to say things about how to do technology better or right or well, instead of poorly. And then the other side of research is technologically informed philosophy. That's where I sort of use technologies as a context for thinking about older or more traditional problems in philosophy, and thinking about how those technologies force us to reframe issues, frame them in ways that are different than we have in the past. And these are not totally unrelated. Often I'll start doing a project in philosophically informed technology, and that'll make me start thinking about a project in technologically informed philosophy. So I'm just going to talk about some of my projects across these different branches. So on the philosophically informed technology side, I'll just briefly mention 3 projects. One is on autonomous vehicles. And there's a lot of people that you may know. Well, I'll get into that in a second. I'm going to go into that in detail. One of the things I've worked on is helping to set up AI oversight committees, telling companies how they can put committees together to do better ethical oversight of AI technologies, much like we have for animal subjects research and human subject research. In the AR and VR space, we recently got a grant with a major tech company. I'm not exactly sure if I'm allowed to say which one, so I'll just err on the side of caution, to help train their engineers to think through the ethical concepts that might arise when all of a sudden the ads that people are experiencing in the world are totally customized to them. So take Facebook, which already has this, but make it all the things you experience. So how do we think through the ethics of that, and how do we design technologies in a way that's safe and somewhat protective of our democracy to the extent that that's still possible? On the AV side, you may know there's this debate about how to use trolley problems to think about designing autonomous vehicles for crash scenarios. And there's sort of what's going on is like there's this standard way that a lot of us moral philosophers think about how to answer ethically sensitive design questions, which is you take a bunch of thought experiments and then you have some principles and you use those thought experiments to sort of, they're almost like evidence in scientific reasoning. You're using them to come up with coherent, cohesive, simple principles that then you can then bring to bear on ethically sensitive design questions. But what the people in these trolley debates want to do is sort of skip the going through principles. They sort of say, hey, this real world accident scenario that a car might be in looks a lot like these famous trolley cases that we've thought of. And so they want to skip the having to balance the principles and just draw right on the thought experiments. And some of my work has been to explain why that's a terrible idea. Not only because it's just methodologically mistaken to try to go from thought experiments to accident scenarios for reasons that I'm happy to talk about someday, but also because it misunderstands the technology. The way you actually get behaviors and accidents through machine learning technologies, which are at the heart of autonomous vehicles, is through training regimes. And how you set up the training regime doesn't just impact individual scenarios, but can have wide-scale effects across all the behaviors the autonomous vehicle might do. So a lot of my work is trying to show how if you're really sensitive to technology, you'll have to think much more carefully about how to apply normative principles to solve these kinds of problems. For example, you have to think about how moral principles apply to setting up training regimes, not how to get specific behaviors of cars. On the other side, the technologically informed philosophy side, I have several different projects. A lot of my work in the past has been on questions of what our moral status. So I'm told it would be wrong to go and poke random people with a stick. And a lot of my work has been trying to figure out what about another being grounds those obligations. And so one of the views that's out there is there's something special about living organisms. There's something about living organisms that gives us moral obligations to those things, but that doesn't apply to artifacts. And so some of my work has been about thinking about the possibility of synthetic organisms, which are real things. They're organisms we build from the ground up, but they occupy two different categories simultaneously. They're at the same time living organisms that are artifacts. And I've thought a lot about how that challenges the sort of views where we try to ground moral status in something special about living beings, but we don't want to allow things like corkscrews to have moral status. And my most recent project is on algorithmic transparency. So as some of you might know, lots of machine learning algorithms are opaque, meaning even experts can't tell how inputs are generating outputs. It's just too complicated. And so my work here is trying to figure out, well, we often talk about the value of transparency and how this is a problem, but there's actually very little work on the multifaceted ways that transparency is valuable. And so a lot of my work is trying to figure out what are the normative bases for different kinds of transparency in different contexts and thinking about what that means. All right, that's it.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think Fatika is back, so she can now continue with her presentation.
Okay, sorry about that. My Wi-Fi crashed, and to keep my Wi-Fi load down, I'm not going to turn on my video, but I will share my screen. So I think where I left you was I was talking about some research questions that I have. How do people draw on African diasporic religion ways of knowing and spiritual technologies to work collectively to make change and build institutions, structures, communities directed at liberation, social justice, and freedom? And what does it mean to be a religion of resistance? What are some of the tensions and challenges to African diasporic religions? Or put another way, does membership in an African religion in diaspora automatically equate with progressive intersectional politics? So there's some fault lines and there's some issues of translation between indigenous philosophical categories of liberation, social justice, and freedom, and how those categories are used in quote unquote the West. And there's some tensions around this, specifically around issues of sexuality and their relationship to the sacred. That's one of the major fault lines. Gender is, and gender roles is another fault line. So I'm interested in those fault lines and how they get negotiated. So my research sites include Oshas United, which is a nationwide group, and I access them mainly through their presence in social media, predominantly Facebook. And they are notable in that they are cross different lineages and different iterations of African diasporic religions. And they've come together in a spiritual mandate from an Orisha, which is a sacred energy that possessed somebody and said, you need to bring people together to work towards social justice. So that's their mandate. I'm interested in Oyatunji village, which is a Yoruba village outside of Sheldon, South Carolina. And they're engaged in certain activities that are geared towards economic and environmental sustainability, as well as social justice. And they work a lot with the Gullah and the Geechee people of South Carolina. And then I'm also very interested in determination and prosperity movement coming out of Oakland, California. And he is reconceptualizing prosperity in a different way that you might be familiar with it in Christian religions. So I'm very interested in that and his work that he's doing in the community on social justice. He also makes films. So that's an interesting component. I teach Introduction to Religious Studies, and I'll be teaching this in the spring. And we do cover social theory, ethnographic methods, religious ritual theory, which we did in class today, materiality, and we use a lot of podcasts and films, as well as our text and doing primary text readings. Please come join me in the spring. I also teach in Africana Studies. And in Africana Studies, I'm teaching in the spring Black popular culture. And we will be taking an intersectional approach to popular culture in the African diaspora, looking at gender and sexuality in Trinidad Carnival, conceptions of race in hip hop in Cuba and Ghana, and issues of class in Brazilian samba and local Afro performance. And so in each segment, as we look at gender, we will also be looking at race and class. As we look at race, we will also be looking at gender and class. And as we look at class, we will also be looking at gender and race. So the pedagogy is intersectional. So my experience teaching is intersectional, and the students' experiences in learning is intersectional. So we're trying to bring together simultaneously an analysis of gender, race, and class, which is challenging but very rewarding. So I think that will wrap me up.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks so much to all the speakers for their presentations and